Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another mini lecture. Today, we're going to talk about planning instruction to increase behavior. Now, before you watch this mini lecture, I would like you to have completed the Affirm module on reinforcement. So if you have not done the Affirm module yet, go ahead and pause this video, complete the Affirm module, and then come back. Right. The reason why I want you to do that is because the Affirm module is going to give you a much broader overview of reinforcement, whereas this mini lecture, I'm going to focus specifically on one aspect of reinforcement, which is the schedules of reinforcement and how to thin our schedules of reinforcement. So again, if you've not done the Affirm modules, go ahead and put this video on pause and go ahead and complete that. All right. For those of you who have completed the Affirm modules, let's go ahead and start our mini lecture. So as always, I have identified 3 learning objectives that I would like you to work towards this week. The first is that you'll be able to generate examples of how you can use reinforcement in your classrooms to increase the desired behavior of your students. Right. Second, I would like for you to be able to identify different types of potential reinforcers and describe how you might be able to find those potential reinforcers for a given student. And then finally, and this is what we're going to focus on in this mini lecture, is comparing schedules of reinforcement and describe the process that you would take to thin reinforcement to avoid students from satiating on their reinforcer. All right, so let's talk about that term, satiation. Satiation simply means the state when a student has had too much of the reinforcer, so much so that the reinforcer is not likely to be reinforcing anymore. So essentially, it's lost its reinforcement potential or its reinforcement power. So imagine if you love Cadbury eggs, right? And you're going to use Cadbury eggs to reinforce yourself for doing good work, right? Now, if you had easy access to Cadbury eggs and were able to eat them throughout the day, then most likely they're not going to be as strong of a reinforcer to you if compared to if you only got them during Easter times. You only got them, a few times during the year, right? It's going to be a much more powerful and stronger reinforcer to you if you do not have full access to them, right? So there's that old saying, too much of a good thing can actually be bad. And that's what satiation simply means, is that when a student has had too much of a good thing, it actually doesn't work the way it's supposed to anymore. So we know of a number of different ways to avoid satiation. So one is to vary the reinforcer. So hopefully, as an educator, you'll know your students well enough to know what kinds of things they like and what kinds of things motivate them. And you'll be able to identify a number of different potential reinforcers for them. So in your instruction, you should be varying the reinforcer throughout the day. Right? Another way to do this is to shorten the instructional session. So imagine if you were doing a 60-minute math lesson in which you were reinforcing the student for appropriate engagement every minute, right? That is 60 opportunities to be reinforced, which is a lot of reinforcement, right? You can imagine that 60 minutes with reinforcing the student every minute would lead to satiation on whatever reinforcer you're using during that math session. Instead, you might consider shortening your instructional session to say 10 minutes. So maybe you do 6 10-minute sessions, but you spread it across the day, right? So that at any given instructional session, they're not likely to satiate on the reinforcer simply because you're limiting how much they're getting in any instructional session, okay? You should also think about switching to alternative reinforcers. So within that 10-minute instructional session, you should use the variety of reinforcers that you know of, right? So you shouldn't just be using the same reinforcer for the full 10-minute session, but switch it up for them. Maybe sometimes you do give them a star. Sometimes you just give them verbal praise, right? Mix it up, okay? You can also think about decreasing the size of the reinforcer. So let's say, for instance, you are reinforcing yourself with Cadbury eggs for every assignment you complete, right? So one thing you can do to avoid satiating on your Cadbury egg is to take a Cadbury egg and divide it in half or even in quarters, right? So you get a quarter of your Cadbury egg after each assignment you complete, right? So that way you are lengthening your access to the reinforcer simply because you're decreasing the size you get at any given point. All right. Another strategy might be to have the student choose. A student will know what they're sick of, right? And what's not motivating to them. So you can give them a choice of 3 different things that they can work for, right? Maybe they're working for extra computer time, maybe they're working for extra recess time, or, early lunch, right? So you can give them the choice, right? And finally, we need to think about being systematic and intentional about our schedules of reinforcement. So how often we deliver reinforcers, right? So that's what I want to focus on in today's mini lecture. So your book talks about moving from what we call a continuous schedule of reinforcer, in which the student receives access to their reinforcement for every time they engage in the target activity, to thinning that schedule to what we call an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. So your book describes 3 different types of intermittent schedules of reinforcement. First is the ratio schedule, then the interval schedule, as well as a response duration schedule. So the type of intermittent schedule that you choose depends on the type of behavior you have. And for each of these types of schedules, they have what they call a fixed schedule as well as a variable schedule. All right. So if you're looking at frequency, right? You're looking at the dimension of frequency, how often the student does something. You would go with a ratio schedule of reinforcement. So ratio schedule means that you are reinforcing the behavior based on the number of times that target behavior occurs, right? So the number of times determines the timing of the reinforcement delivery, okay? So with a fixed ratio schedule, right? Fixed means it's the same each time, right? The number of appropriate responses required for a reinforcer is held constant, right? So let's say, for example, the 5th grade teacher provides 5 minutes of extra recess for students who turn in their homework all 5 days of the week, right? So basically every 5 days, they get 5 minutes, right? The next 5 days, they'll get an extra 5 minutes, right? So it's fixed because it's every 5 days. That doesn't change, right? But the reinforcer is delivered contingent upon the number of times that target behavior occurs. So 5 times equals 5 extra minutes, okay? In a variable schedule, that simply means that it varies, right? But on average, it occurs a certain number of times. So in a variable ratio schedule, the number of appropriate responses required for the reinforcement varies, but averages to be the same thing. So let's say you have a teacher, Mr. Johnson, is moving around the room, delivering positive reinforcement, so praise, right, to students who are completing the first 2 problems, right? And then the 4 problems, and then 3 problems, right? In a variable interval schedule, the number of responses varies, but the average response is consistent, right? So on average, the teacher is reinforcing every 3rd question completed, right? But sometimes that may be he reinforces Sally for 2, and then next time is 4, and then 3. But on average, he's reinforcing the students or praising the students every 3rd correct answer or response. Okay, so ratio schedule is really based on the number of times the target behavior happens. If it's fixed, it means that is held constant. If it's variable, it means on average. Okay. Now, interval schedules are appropriate for when we are looking at time. Okay, so the time is the standard. So it's when you see the behavior occur once, right? And then a passage of time, right? In fixed interval schedules, that passage of time is constant. In variable schedules, that passage of time is variable, right? And varies on average. All right. So let me give you an example because I know that's tricky. So in a fixed interval schedule, remember, it's the time that is standard. Reinforcement is delivered for the first response after a specific amount of time, right? So after 3 minutes of questions and answers, Mr. Russ provides praise to Sarah for raising her hand to answer the question. Okay, so he's waiting 3 minutes. So this is a fixed interval of 3 minutes. He waits 3 minutes, and then when Sarah raises her hand, which is the target behavior, he's going to reinforce her. And he's the natural reinforcement for raising your hand is to get called upon, right? So this is a FI, or fixed interval, 3 minutes. So she raised her hand, right? 3 minutes passes. And then the next time she raises her hand after those 3 minutes, he's going to reinforce her. So if she raised her hand before that, right, that's fine, but he wouldn't call on her because he's not reinforcing it until after 3 minutes. Okay? Right? So variable interval is similar, but it's going to be on average every 3 minutes, right? So in that example, it could be that Sarah raises her hand, right? He calls on her. And then the next time he says, I'm going to call on her after 2 minutes, and then after 4 minutes, and then after 3 minutes. So that's a variable interval schedule of 3. Okay. Versus response duration. Response duration is appropriate when you are interested in the duration, so how long the behavior occurs, right? So let's say we are focused on time on task, right? It is independent work time, and we want to reinforce Sarah for working independently on her homework, right, or the assignment. So response duration, if it's fixed, means that you have a constant number in your mind. So I'm going to tell myself, I'm going to go ahead and pat Sarah on the back and give her a thumbs up after 3 continuous minutes of her target behavior. So I need to observe her engaging in on-task behavior, so working on her assignment for 3 minutes. After 3 minutes, then I'm going to give her a thumbs up, right? Or give her some praise, right? So that's a fixed response duration schedule of 3, okay? Versus a variable response duration of 3 means that on average every 3 minutes, right? I'm a teacher, I'm busy, so I can't for sure deliver the reinforcer every 3 minutes. So it might be 2 minutes, it might be 4 minutes, but on average it's going to be 3 minutes, right? But with response duration, it's a continuous amount of time that the target behavior occurs, right? So I like this little visual that is in your book. So this talks about how we need to be conscious of moving from a dense schedule of reinforcement to what we call a sparse schedule of reinforcement. This is called thinning reinforcement. So oftentimes when we're teaching a new skill, we reinforce it every single time we see it, right? Because we want to strengthen that behavior in that child's repertoire. Right, so it is very common that we start off with what we call a CRS, a continuous reinforcement schedule, every single time that behavior occurs, right? Then we move to an intermittent schedule of reinforcement because we want to thin our reinforcement schedule so that we are avoiding satiation, right? If you are looking at frequency, you would consider a ratio schedule, right? Or an interval schedule. Right? If you are looking at duration, you would thin to a response duration schedule. And again, with any of these types of schedules, there is a fixed as well as a variable schedule, right? And then eventually we're going to thin it to it's just what would occur naturally, right? So let's give my example of reinforcing Sarah raising her hand, okay? Now, at first, we're teaching her to raise her hand so she's not blurting out in class. Right? So the teacher is going to reinforce Sarah every single time she raises her hand. It doesn't matter how many times she does it, but every time I see that hand raise, I'm going to call on her because that's the natural reinforcement for raising your hand is to be called on. So every single time I'm going to call on her, right? But you can see how that's not feasible, right? Or nor is it appropriate, right? Not every student gets called on every single time they raise their hand. Right? So I need to then, now that I am sure that Sarah knows how to raise her hand, it's part of her behavioral repertoire now, let's start thinning that schedule, right? So I'm going to thin it to using a fixed ratio schedule of 5, right? Because Sarah raises her hand a lot now, and I can't call on her every single time because I need to give my other students opportunities to respond. So I tell myself, I'm going to go ahead and call upon Sarah or reinforce Sarah for raising her hand every 5th time she raises her hand. So that's an FR5, a fixed ratio of 5. And then eventually, after some time, I'm going to thin it to just whatever is naturally occurring. So I'm going to call on Sarah just as often as I call on any other students, right? Okay. So just to summarize here, I want to highlight some tips about using reinforcement to increase behavior. The very first step is to make sure you have potential reinforcers. So your book talks a lot about different kinds of reinforcers and how you might be able to identify possible reinforcers for your student. So reinforcers are critical, and having good reinforcers are critical to good instruction. Right? If possible, we want to consider creating a deprivation state from the reinforcer, right? We know reinforcers are strongest when students don't have easy access to it. So make sure it's something that they don't get a lot at home, right? Or they don't get a lot throughout the day, right? We want to make sure that our student understands the contingency between the appropriate behavior and receiving access to the reinforcer, right? So oftentimes we want to pair any reinforcer we're giving them with specific praise. Like, you are working really hard. Good job. You get a star for this class. Right? So make sure you are being explicit about what they're being reinforced for. Right? Make sure that when you are initially building a behavior, so if this is a new behavior for the student, you want to make sure that their initial attempts are achievable so that their appropriate behavior can actually get reinforced. Okay. So if we're talking about time on task, for instance, if Sarah right now, her baseline, the amount of time that she stays on task regularly is less than a minute, we don't want to set a goal of her sitting for 5 minutes before she accesses her reinforcer, right? Maybe we start off with, a minute and a half. Right? We want to make sure that our initial goal or criteria is actually achievable so that they can come in contact with the reinforcer. Right? You want to make sure you're only applying the reinforcer when you see that target behavior. So the reinforcer is delivered contingently upon seeing that behavior, and you're not applying it if the appropriate behavior does not occur. Right? They only get access to the reinforcer when the target behavior occurs. And then, of course, we want to avoid satiation and move towards what is just the natural schedule of reinforcement. So that's that process of thinning from a dense schedule to a sparse schedule. All right. So remaining asynchronous tasks for this week. So before the class meeting, please make sure that you have read chapter 8 of your textbook. Hopefully you've already done the Affirm module, and you have watched this mini lecture. So all that you have left is your discussion rule and your quiz. And I will see you all on Thursday. Bye, everyone.